Thank you, everybody. Could you put your number in the chat?
Okay. So it looks like we have a pretty decent, there's a lot of almost vegans here, so I'm going to be preaching to the choir. All right. Do you want me to start, Seth?
Yes, please.
All right. So I'm going to share my screen. So thanks very much for inviting me. I hope you can see already on this slide that the most important thing when reducing meat consumption is showing delicious alternatives. So that's where I'll start. And I'm really excited about being part of this dialogue. I want to also use this opportunity for a little bit of advertisement. So first of all, please, if you don't already know, make sure you sign our petition for Maura Healey for the against the private jet expansion in Hanscom. I'll put a link in the chat later. And also, Margie wrote a wonderful review for my recent publication, this book that came out in March, which is a translation of German young climate activists. So I want to put a plug in for that. Now, some of you may have read the op-ed that I wrote about this, which is what got Seth to invite me. Giving up meat isn't painful, climate chaos is. If you haven't read it, I'll be happy to share that as well. And let's see. So, you know, even though I'm a pastor's daughter, I'm hoping that I won't be preaching to you, but just showing why it's a logical step to take if we're serious about the climate crisis. So it seems to me like just from these numbers that people put in the chat that people are quite aware of the connection between meat consumption and climate, and aware of the role of animal agriculture in the climate crisis. Though my experience has interestingly been that even among climate activists and climate scientists, the number of vegans and vegetarians is not necessarily much larger than it is in the regular public. I don't have statistics about that, but that's just been my anecdotal evidence. So I'm glad we're talking about this. I'm not a specialist that studies this particular phenomenon, but if anyone has questions that require me to go deeper than I can, then I'm certainly happy to, you know, find the answers for you from people who do study this in more detail. So as you see, the planet is mostly water, of course, over 70% to be precise. And so if you look at this slide, you see that the ocean, you know, the 71%, that should actually continue on to the right, like for a long time. So they just couldn't make it on one slide. So it's important to remember this. So only 29% of the Earth is land, and of that 29%, only 71% is habitable. So that it's not glacier or desert and so on. And of those 71%, 38% is forest still, and we know that that's being rapidly depleted every year. But an even larger percentage is 46% is agriculture. And then if you look at the percentage of the land that is used for agriculture, 77% is used for livestock, meat and dairy production, and only 23% that, excluding the livestock feed, is used for other crops. And what's really interesting are these last two bars, because of those 23% is actually where most of the calorie supply and the protein supply comes from worldwide, right? So the 77% of the agricultural land that we're using only produces 18% of the caloric need supply and 37% of the protein supply. So that doesn't look like a particularly efficient way of feeding people. And there's another way of looking at it here, where you can see that many millions of tons of grains globally are produced for cattle feed. So 59% of all corn that is grown around the world is grown to feed cattle. 57% of all oilseeds, including soy, is grown to feed cattle. So when people tell you, oh, but soy production is really bad because they're cutting down the forests for it, the soy that is produced there is produced for animals, to feed animals. And we have to look at this through the lens of population, because we're now roughly at 8 billion people, right? And even though population growth has been slowing, we're looking, at least for the foreseeable future, at significant further growth. So we could be looking at between 9 and over 12 billion people on this planet within this century. And those all have to be fed. So, you know, obviously the estimates diverge, but you can see that it's definitely not going down fast enough for this not to be a factor. And there is also, you know, often in the argument that, well, population growth is the wrong way to look at it because consumption is the biggest problem, but they often go together. And so if you look at this slide, you can see that a large population that is also in the median range of growth in terms of numbers is in the US, and we are also enormously large per capita emitters and, of course, meat consumers. Here you have, you know, the US, this is from 2018, being the top total annual meat consumers in the world, followed by Australia, which is, of course, much smaller. So the fact that we're also so large is really a big problem. And if you look at this slide, and this is in kilograms, sorry, I have European slides in between, then you see the injustice that is built into this, because the parts of the world that are most severely impacted by climate disruption, of course, are not contributing as much to this, which is true for many climate issues, and there's no difference here when it comes to meat consumption. So total greenhouse gas emissions from meat are roughly around 14.5%, 15%. It's, you know, depends exactly how you count. And Paul Hawken has said that if cattle were their own nation, they would be the world's third largest emitter of greenhouse gases. We'll get back to Paul Hawken in a moment. The problem is that meat consumption overall is not going down, it's going up, right? This is a projection by the UN, and they're expecting meat consumption to dramatically increase over the next few years. In the US, plenty of states derive their agricultural income from crops grown for animal consumption. So you can see here, you know, from green to red. So green is food that's made for human consumption, and red is food that's made for, crops that are grown for animal consumption. And there's an interesting political parallel here, right? That's significant. And of course, since there's so many of you are already reducing your meat intake, you probably all know that the problem with cattle especially is methane. Methane being far worse in terms of greenhouse impact than CO2. And that has to do with the actual burping and farting of the cow itself, the dairy process, and the feedlots. And of course, manure also, everything contributes to the methane emissions. Oops, what happened here? So to see that in numbers, an adult cow, no, I can't see my own. Let me see. I can't actually read it because it's so high. How can I hide video? No. An adult cow may be a very small source by itself, emitting only 80 to 110 kilograms of methane, but 100 million cattle in the US and 1.2 billion large ruminants in the world. Ruminants are one of the largest methane sources. In the US, cattle emit about 5.5 million metric tons of methane per year, accounting for 20% of methane emissions. Globally, they produce about 80 million metric tons, accounting for about 28% of global methane emissions. That's a huge problem. And when you look at this through the lens of our diets, you can see that we have choices, right? So here you see that certain types of food have a much higher carbon footprint than others. Red meat being the biggest, but there's others too, like cheese. Usually people don't want to think of dairy as a big culprit, but it is. There's another way of looking at it. Here you see the greenhouse gas emission per 4-ounce serving, beef being the winner, lamb also, of course, but lamb is not consumed as much, so it's, you know, not there, its impact is not as severe. But cheese is really high up there because of all the processes that go into making cheese, and of course also, you know, the fact that you need cows to make cheese. Whereas if you look at the bottom, beans and lentils and rice and even plant-based chicken, you know, are much, much lower in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions. This is a bit fuzzy, but here is the same idea, just sort of shown from left to right. And so it's very easy to see, okay, if I want to have a lower impact diet, then obviously I'm going to try to avoid stuff that is further to the right. And that's in fact the case. So if people opt for a vegan diet, they cut their greenhouse gases more than in half. My son turned vegan when he was in high school, and then he came home and he said, "Mom, I'm only using up 1.5 planets thanks to being vegan." And I had to burst his bubble and say, well, 1.5 planets is more than we have, though. But yes, not 4. True. Nice. We're on the right track. But you can see here that, you know, anything you can do to reduce meat is going to be better for the planet. And that is, you know, in this slide, it's sort of broken down a little bit more in terms of the pieces that make up the emissions. And you can see here that coffee is up, also up there. But I know people probably won't want to give up coffee. And even the stuff that is lower in emissions, of course, isn't always, I mean, it may have other environmental impacts, right? Like fish, for example, if you've looked into that, there's a huge issue, of course, with overfishing and with antibiotics use in fish farms and so on. So Paul Hawken has studied this with his team at Drawdown, and they actually now have put plant-rich diet on number 2 of the scale. It was on number 5 for many years when they first started out. But reducing food waste and plant-rich diets are really the top most cost-effective measures people can take to address the climate crisis. I mean, this is scientifically calculated. So I just think that that is really one of the most important, lenses through which we can look at this. But of course, there are many other good reasons to reduce meat consumption. It, as you mentioned, it includes health, and even the official Harvard studies that show what we should be eating, they clearly show that vegetables, fruits, and whole grains, that's where the bulk of our food should come from. We've known that for a long time, right? This is no news. But for most people, this pyramid looks exactly the other way around, and they eat a lot of food, cheese and meat, and not enough vegetables. And the other reason, of course, is the treatment of our fellow creatures. I mean, the factory farms are outrageously inhumane, and they just should not exist and should be banned. There should be a moratorium on any such farms, and they should just not exist. And people who consume meat usually don't want to look this in the eye. And in fact, now we have states where even journalists are not allowed to film or report from such feedlots. And so we don't get to see the disastrous conditions. I mean, there was some emphasis on it during COVID, because so many plants were affected severely by COVID, but otherwise people just don't see what goes on in these factory farms. And I think that's really, really problematic. So I think I'll stop there, and I'll hand it over to Marianne.
Marianne, before you present, I just want to say that if you have questions, I see some people have already been doing this. Why don't you put them in the chat? When Marianne finishes her presentation, we'll have a lot of time for question and answer. We'll do a little bit of talking in breakout groups, and then we'll all come back together to discuss all the issues that people are raising. So if you feel like you can both listen and type in a chat question at the same time, please do so. If you can't, we'll also just be recognizing raised hands when questions and answers come about. Thank you, Marianne, and thank you, Sabine, for excellent presentation. I think one of the questions that always comes up is this going to be recorded, and will people's slides become available? I don't want to answer for Sabine about the slides, but Sabine, would those slides be available? Excellent. Thank you.
And mine can be available also. So thank you, Sabine. Appreciated your presentation, and thanks, Seth, for organizing, and to everybody who gave up their evening to come. So I'm going to talk, as Seth said, a little bit about influencing behavior, and these are ideas. I'm doing a little bit of advertising like Sabine did, self-promotion in my book, In This Together, Connecting with Your Community to Combat the Climate Crisis. Okay, so there's lots of ways to influence behavior, and I'm going to cover 3 tonight, hopefully quickly. And I did cover the last one, social networks, on our last call on travel. And so I'll either go through that quickly, or if the time's getting short, Seth, we can just skip that one. Okay, so probably most of you know what choice architecture is, but it's basically the healthy or the good or the default option is the right option. And so, it's funny because when I show my students at Cornell now, like this cartoon, I'm not even going to show it to them anymore because they have no idea who Homer Simpson was, but I'm assuming a lot of you do, just given our age. So the idea here is that Homer would come into Apu's shop, he would grab a donut, it was right there on the counter, it was easily available. And one day Apu decides to employ some choice architecture, and he's trying to get Homer and the policemen to eat healthily by putting the donuts way out of reach and putting the healthy fruits right within reach. So just as another example, I used to give workshops in China, and I do environmental education for teachers and non-formal or educators who work in botanic gardens, museums, and nature centers and so forth. And so we were doing this workshop, this training in China, and it was at the Hangzhou Botanic Gardens. And we ordered out lunch. My host ordered out lunch. And I swear we had piles and piles of plastic trash after the lunch, like you can see on the left. And this bothered me. So I talked to my host and I said, well, gee, can we do anything about that for tomorrow? And lo and behold, the next day they brought me a reusable dish and some utensils. And we went over to the Hangzhou Botanic Gardens cafeteria where all the employees that worked at the garden would eat. And you couldn't get food unless you had your own dish. And then we had this little dishwashing thing right there at the cafeteria. And in the back, you can't see it, but they actually had some sort of UV contraption that would sterilize your dishes. But everybody had their own individual dishes in any case. And so that's an example of choice architecture. It made it very easy not to bring all this plastic. The default option was the right option. Okay, so you could influence choice architecture by what you serve for dinner, and maybe you have some ideas you could put in the chat. But with my students, it's pretty easy. They often invite friends over for plant-rich meals, and they have a lot of fun exchanging recipes and trying new things. During COVID, and even now, like especially if students who can't travel home very much, it's a great way for them to connect with their family. They say, oh, I have a project at school and I have to, do something with plant-rich diet. They don't have to do plant-rich diet. They can choose other actions, but, try out these recipes and see how they go. So again, the idea of influencing other people. Well, the second example might not really be choice architecture, but the first example, when you invite friends over or maybe invite them to a restaurant that serves vegan options or plant-rich options, then the sort of default option becomes the option that they will choose. Okay, so I want to go on and talk about a different influence on behaviors called social norms. And there's a lot of different kinds of norms. And one is called descriptive norms. So that's what most others do. So there would be a message, a descriptive norm message might be something like, most people express concern about the climate. Most elders volunteer for an organization, or most Democrats contribute money to an environmental organization. There's also injunctive norms, which are what you say that somebody else should do. So it would be something like, you should care about the climate, or you should volunteer for a climate organization, or you should contribute money to an environmental organization. And there was an experiment, a bunch of you may have heard about this, but probably some of you haven't. So this was the hotel towel experiment. And basically you would go into your room in the hotel and you would have a little placard there, and there'd be one of two messages. So this is the first message: join your fellow guests in helping to save the environment. Almost 75% of guests who are asked to participate in our new resource savings program do help by using their towels more than once. You can join your fellow guests in this program, etc. So you can see it's a descriptive norm message that they were receiving. They were saying, most of the guests here actually are going to reuse their towel. So you don't throw it on the floor, you put it on the hook or whatever. So that was one message. The second message was more of an injunctive message, an injunctive norm message: help save the environment. You can show your respect for nature and help save the environment by using your towels during your stay, kind of implying that you should do this. So which message do you think was more effective in people reusing their towels? I can't see the chat, but if anybody wants to put descriptive or injunctive in the chat, and maybe Seth, you can tell me if anybody's written anything. I could stop sharing and see the chat, but oh no, maybe I could do it right here. Okay, yes, I can do it and keep this up. Injunctive, Paul thinks injunctive. Paul. Descriptive, Amy, descriptive, John. Descriptive, Paul, I think you're in the minority here. But that's okay, because this is just to, now I'm trying to close my chat, sorry. Okay, oops. Okay, so it was actually the descriptive norm resulted in 27% higher towel reuse rate relative to the injunctive norm. So, and that's in general. If you have a behavior that's most people are doing, usually a descriptive norm is more effective than an injunctive norm. So people don't like to be told what they should be doing or try to be shamed. They like to be told what everybody else is doing, and then they might do it also. Okay, but what if the behavior, like veganism, is not what most people do? I can't say, like most people are vegans. It wouldn't be true. So, and I don't think anybody would believe me, even if it was an experiment. So I can't use that message. So in this case, we can use what are called dynamic or trending norms. They're the same thing. So I think I use mostly dynamic here in what I have, but just remember that these are a kind of norm that you can use if most people don't do the desired behavior. And here's some dynamic norm messages. The number of US consumers identifying as vegan grew from 1 to 6% between 2014 and 2017, a 600% increase. Or sales of plant-based alternatives to animal-based foods, including meat, cheese, milk, and eggs, grew 17% over the past year, compared to US food sales, only 2%. So the idea is we're trying to convince people that this is the trend, that this is what everybody else is doing. More and more people are doing this. And then maybe people will want to jump on board, because even though it's not what most people are doing, it's what a lot of maybe cool people are doing. Okay, so this experiment was done at a Stanford cafeteria. And again, there was actually 3 messages. They had a control, but we'll just talk about the 2 messages. One was a descriptive norm and one was a dynamic norm. And so the first one, so this is messages that were given to students as they waited in line before they ordered their meal in a cafeteria. So the first message was, some people limit how much meat they eat. This is true both nationally and here at Stanford. Specifically, research has shown that 30% of Americans make an effort to limit their meat consumption. That means 3 in 10 people eat less meat than otherwise would. Okay, and then the second one is, some people are starting to limit how much meat they eat. This is true both nationally and here at Stanford. Specifically, recent research has shown that over the last 5 years, 30% of Americans have started to make an effort to limit their meat consumption. That means in recent years, 3 in 10 people have changed their behavior and begun to eat less meat than they would otherwise. So this is, the second one is the dynamic norm message. So here are the results. The higher the bar of these 3 bars, that means more participants, more of these Stanford students ordered a meatless lunch. So one of these bars is the control, one of them's the descriptive, and one of them's the dynamic. So just think for a minute, which one you think had the most effect on students ordering meatless lunches? Okay, so you can see here that the dynamic norm that more and more people are eating meatless meals actually resulted in more students ordering meatless meals. Interesting, the descriptive norm, which I think was something like 30% of students are eating less meat. It wasn't significant, but it has a little lower number of students who ordered a meatless lunch compared to the control. And I think we run the danger if we say 30% of people are eating less meat, we just give the descriptive norm message that we might want people to do what 70% of people are doing, which is not eating less meat. And the control was a message not related to meat consumption at all. All right, so descriptive norms, what most others do. Dynamic norms, more and more people do, change over time. More and more people are eating meatless meals. Just a little summary, you see the references there, if anybody wants to read the original articles. And then here's some figures from a Pew Research survey. So we see that, well, what the question I'm getting at is, what if the behavior is not the majority and not trending? So we can't say that more and more people are doing this and it's not trending. I'll get that to that in a minute. So we see that 24% of US adults have made efforts to support climate action in the past year. That includes donating, more of an advocacy, contacting officials, volunteering, like you all do, an Elders Climate Action, and attending a protest, so more of an activism action. And unfortunately, boomers, which I assume we all are, fewer of us are active on climate change than these other generations. But maybe most of us are Democrats, so we're doing that a little better there. Now, interestingly, in the same survey, it said more younger adults, these would be like our grandkids or our kids, say they have been encouraged by family or friends to do more on climate change. So you can see here that Gen Z, 36% say that they've been encouraged to get more involved in efforts to reduce the effects of climate change by a friend or a family member. So this is where it becomes, again, important to be talking with our close social networks, our family and our friends, and seeing if we can get them interested in taking some of these actions that we might be taking already. So Seth, do you want me to go quickly over this that I talked about last time, or just kind of go to the end? You got to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the time here, Marianne, and want to make sure that we leave time for discussion. So if you could do this in a few minutes, I think that would be great.
Okay, we'll just go over this really quickly. So this is about different structures of social networks. And basically the only important thing here is that the round circles are people, and these lines, whether they're curved or less curved, are ties. So in this particular one, if you're next to somebody, that means that you're communicating with them or doing things with them often. But say if you have this kind of tie, it's called a weak tie. You're not really doing things with them very often. And I'm going to show you a quick animation. I think it's about 30 seconds. So the idea is in this, which is a clustered or a social network where people are close to each other. They see each other often. They communicate often. And the blue dots you'll see in the animation is it means it's an individual who's adopted a new behavior. And here you have this more random network where we have a lot of weak ties, not very many close ties. And so the question is, will these blue dots spread more rapidly in this close tie network or this weak tie network? And I have to move it up to the...
So we know from epidemiology
Just
that
a
the
minute.
pattern who's connected to whom, so the social network in a society, can affect the diffusion.
Got to move it up to where he shows the animation.
We've embedded people in social networks. You can see here the left-hand side has a kind of residential structured network, and the right-hand side has a casual contact network. And then we seeded them with behaviors and watch them spread. I'm going to watch these spread simultaneously, and what you see is that in the residential networks, people are adopting in these neighborhoods, and then there's a spillover effect where the behavior spreads to the next neighborhood, and so forth. In the casual contact network, you can see it sort of spreads all over the network, but it spreads more slowly. And in fact, at the end of this process, you get many more adopters in the residential network than in the casual contact network. Now this is striking and really surprising. So it means is that behavior spread really differently than disease does. So the intuitions from epidemiology about diffusion dynamics don't generalize. But
Okay, so he goes on to talk about how, people, well, unfortunately with COVID now, they're going to the airport, but let's just think about measles. Remember a few years ago, we had several outbreaks at, I think, Minneapolis Airport, at Disneyland in California. And these are very weak tie networks, right? You walk by somebody, you can get measles from them, but you're not going to catch behaviors from people that you're not very close to. That's the idea of this. And that, yes, there are influencers, but most of us aren't influencers. So we really need to think about these close tie networks. And just as a summary, if you're trying to change this person in the middle of their behavior, you could have one communicator telling them to, hey, reduce meat consumption. They haven't changed their behavior. Maybe two people that they know are telling them and they still haven't changed. But three, when you're getting this from, because you're sort of all close friends, you're getting the message from multiple messengers, then that might influence you to change your behaviors. All right, so network climate action is just this idea of trying to influence your close friends. And here's an example from actually an online student. Her name is, she's in the middle, Fatima Delgado. She was a student at the University of Barcelona, or University in Barcelona. And she invited her friends who are also graduate students over for sustainable tapas brunches. And she invited them several times. So they're getting this message, not only from her, but from their other friends. And because she's doing this several times, they're getting this message about plant-rich diet multiple times. And I'm not going to go over this because I'll give you the slides, but this is just an article about communication strategies. If people have questions, we can come back to it. But communications you can use when you're talking to friends and family about different sorts of behaviors. So that's all. That's all I have.
Well, Marianne, thank you very much. I'm going to change the view here to gallery view, and we want to encourage questions. We're going to follow questions and answers with a brief think, pair, share exercise, which I'll explain to you. And then we're going to come back together and discuss what we're thinking, feeling, and planning to do. I would say that if we can try to limit this question and answer period to true questions rather than comments, that would be good, because there will be more time later on for discussion. And I'm sure that there are a lot of comments and thoughts that people will want to share, but I'm going to give priority to people who are asking questions. So are there any questions that people have put into the chat? I see one, or a couple actually, going back to when we, after Sabine spoke, but please put your questions in, and I'm going to send a question Sabina's way. Sabina, why are shrimp and prawns so high on the list? Do you know?
Yeah, apparently it's because where they are grown, where they are raised, deforestation is an issue. So their mangrove forests, for example, are being cut down for these shrimp farms. And so that's mainly why I actually put an article in the chat that I can, just to Sarah, but I can share it with everyone else so everyone else can see it too, because it is confusing at first, because you think, why would that be different? But of course, the problem with any, seafood is that the idyllic idea that we had from earlier times, that someone is fishing and getting us a fish, that's just as false nowadays as the factory farm images that I showed you for meat, right? Because we've depleted the normal grounds, and so most of the seafood that is consumed today is produced under, sort of factory farming like conditions. But anyway, I'll post that link in the chat for everyone.
Now, coffee was high up on the list, and as you said, most of us are not going to be too happy about reducing our coffee consumption. But Paul had asked, is tea better than coffee? And maybe you could, if you have any insights into why coffee is so destructive, please share them with us.
I think it's the same issue, that it has to do with deforestation, because of the increase. But and tea, of course, it depends what kind of tea, right? I mean, I drink mostly herbal teas, for example, and you can, they can be locally grown. You can even have them in your garden. Like I have mints from from Tony's garden, I think. You know, so it also depends where it's coming from and how it's grown. Like when I buy coffee, I only buy coffee that's coming from fair trade sources. And that also includes, you know, other issues, not just carbon, but also the treatment of the workers that grow it and so on.
There was a question about excuse me for 1 second. Climate carnivore do you know what that is?
Climate carnivore?
Yeah, I know what it is. It would be somebody who chooses to eat meats that are low on the emissions. So somebody who chooses to eat chicken, for example, or maybe chicken and pork instead of cheese and red meat. Or you guys are in Massachusetts, I'm in upstate New York. Deer, you know, well, deer has it's another ruminant, so I think it produces quite a bit of methane, but it's such an overpopulation. It's not being raised on a factory farm. So a climate carnivore might feel good about eating deer.
There are a couple of cheese-related questions. Speaking of cheese, why does cheese have such a higher carbon footprint than other dairy products such as milk or yogurt? And somebody had asked, is there anybody that's found a good vegan cheese?
Well, I tried serving some vegan cheeses yesterday to my friends who are not vegan, and they were not impressed. I agree that there are there's new products coming out like literally every day, it seems, and they're certainly getting better. I mean, a few years ago, even the meat alternatives were really hard to stomach, and you had to be really, really willing to sacrifice. That's changed dramatically. Some like the milk, you mentioned the Miyokos products, the Viola, I think I like the fact that some of them are now also available organic, because I'm really worried that a lot of the vegan products that are meat alternatives and cheese alternatives are not organic, and I don't think that that's necessarily much better. So I really try to only purchase the ones that are organically grown or produced. And yeah, with cheese, as far as I know, the main issue is just the enormous processes that are involved that are very carbon intensive. It takes a long time to make cheese, and it needs to be, you know, heated very high and cooled very low and all that. But Marianne might know more about this. I don't know.
About
Cheese,
no,
why cheese
I
has
mean,
such a high carbon footprint.
why cheese?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, because it's concentrated. I'm sorry, I was trying to answer another question, but you think about the amount of milk that goes into a serving of milk versus the amount of milk that goes into a serving of cheese.
Yeah.
And that's also why yogurt is almost as good as milk, because I think it's mostly liquid.
Got it.
Yeah.
So there's a comment that that Alan Fierce has made, which he's turned into a question. And Alan, rather than me state it, why I'd like you to pose that as a question or as a comment, either one.
Oh, sure, thanks. Well, my comment is, you know, I have learned that eating mammal meat is really quite unhealthy, that it is associated with a higher risk of colon cancer, gastrointestinal cancers, diabetes, and what else did I say there? And
Cardiovascular disease.
cardiovascular, heart, yeah, I should remember that one. And I read a newsletter by a fellow named Dr. Gabe Merkin, writes a fitness, health, and nutrition newsletter. In fact, my link in there is from his website. I used to follow him for fitness reasons because I'm kind of a jock. But when I started having heart problems, I started reading what he was writing about in terms of the heart issues. And it was at that point in time that I stopped eating mammal meat completely. And I think that's an argument that needs to be made stronger when trying to convince people not to eat meat. Or is that a bad idea when you're threatening their health?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would assume it depends on the person, right? It worked for you, but you were already interested in good health. So, you know, it's kind of like, I didn't know that food waste was such a big problem, but when I read about it in Drawdown, I immediately, you know, tried to be much more conscious about food waste. But I was already predisposed to an environmental message. I could see that somebody who really enjoys meat, that could be a threat to their identity, so they're going to react negatively. And I would also say that it's not like that message hasn't been out there, right? I mean,
Yeah,
I don't know.
in
It's
a
pretty,
study.
it's pretty, you know, much in the media that Americans are obese and eat too much. Maybe not. I don't know. But I think, you know, I think you'd really have to think about a message that would work for an individual, depending on their identity and their interests. Does that make sense?
Yes, I want to just note that there are several great suggestions and comments about Margie Leah's comments about the importance of eating less processed food, and others have made comments here as well. There's one more question I'd like to ask, and then I want to engage all of us in talking to each other, which is probably the most important thing we can be doing. Amy Meltzer had asked a question about fish. Is wild caught fish better for the climate than farm fish? Anybody have any thoughts about that?
I mean, I can give some thoughts, and Sabine, it sounds like it looks as if you're thinking about that, because I think as Amy put in her question, it's pretty complicated, right? So I think in general it is, because you have the fuel that you're using to catch the, you know, in these big boats, right? But basically you don't have land clearing. You, and I think that I've been, shrimp now farms are going all up and down like the Midwest, right? So then they're being raised in these artificial ponds. There's high energy costs. Now, what I don't know is, and of course, like if in Norway and Iceland, you know, where they have huge like salmon mariculture, I don't know if they've gotten it down, you know, so that their feed input per unit of protein is pretty low, because they're probably experimenting on this all the time, no matter what else you might think about that kind of, you know, it's essentially kind of semi-industrial agriculture is what our mariculture. However, they're probably not using you know, I mean, you know, there's so many factors, like where's the feed coming from, and is that, I think in a lot of cases that's wild caught. So I just think it's complicated, but it's probably unique for each fish even. So if somebody's interested, I know some people work on this, and I could get some more resources. I think my colleague has been working on this, sort of what is the feed that's going into aquaculture especially in Asian countries, and, you know, how do you account for those energy and externalities when you're raising a lot of protein that way.
I have a friend who studies this also, and I should be able to get some information out to people about that. It's a good question. What I'd like to do now is, with your permission, is ask people to engage in an exercise. We're going to spend about 5 minutes with this, and then we're all going to come back together and have some broader discussion. I think that we've learned a lot of important facts. We also learned about how we can amplify our own individual decisions by engaging with neighbors, friends, and if we were trying to create messages, what kinds of messages work best if we were going beyond just our own individual social networks. But what I'd like to do now is to ask people to really think about, okay, what are we going to do with this information? A lot of you who at the beginning we're at 8 or 9 or 10, probably don't need to do much, except perhaps maybe figure out a communication strategy to share your behaviors with other people. But there are a lot of us who are around 4 or 5 who've tried to reduce meat consumption, but still have a ways to go. Maybe didn't know about cheese, which is a killer for me anyway, but or coffee for that matter. And want to think about, is there something more I should be doing, and how would I do that? So I'm going to put a few questions into the chat right now. And these are questions that you're going to discuss in breakout rooms in a minute, but your breakout room will just be you and a random partner. I want people to, when I taught 5th grade, we called this think, pair, share, where we really want to give you a couple of minutes to jot down a couple of things before you start sharing, so that your sharing will be informed by your thinking. And the questions are there in the chat. If you haven't opened up the chat, do that now, but I will also read them. What action do you hope to take to further reduce your consumption of animal products? What will be the biggest obstacle, hardest thing to overcome? Might be your own personal likes or dislikes, or it might be something in your family, or maybe something to do with the budget or something like that. And how will you engage your community, meaning the media community, family, friends, to support or amplify your action? I hope that people don't drop off because of it's going into a breakout room, but I think the idea is this will really help us to think about our conversations and how we plan to go about making a change. And I think that it's that deliberation that really makes change more likely. So take a minute. In 1 minute, I'm going to put you in breakout rooms. And then in 5 minutes, we're going to get back together. Okay? Might want to take a couple of notes. All right. I'm going to create these rooms, and it's 6:06 now. We're going to come back at 6:11, and we're going to share out the kinds of things that came up in our brief conversation. I'd encourage you to each take about 3 minutes to share. Okay. So you're going to have to go down to breakout rooms and join your group. Andrea, if you're there, go down to the bottom of your screen and you'll see breakout rooms. You join those.